Well, to start with, I'm a Missourian. I was born on a Missouri farm, went to a one-room school, and then to a high school in a small town of about 500. And at that time, I had a very interesting and devoted teacher who was interested in science, taught math and science, and got me really interested in science. And so I came to the university and took a degree in bachelor's degree in chemistry. And at that time, the university didn't have a so-called biochemistry department, but the agricultural college had agricultural chemistry as a department, and that was headed by Dr. A.G. Hogan, who was really a nutritionist. He was educated by one of the founders of nutrition. And from that, I got a good interest and background in research in nutrition. As a graduate student, I worked on the isolation of what Dr. Hogan had named vitamin BC. It was a B vitamin required by the chicken. And we assayed for this vitamin by feeding chickens, baby chickens, a purified diet and adding supplements to it, and which prevented anemia in these chickens. And I was involved trying to isolate or purify, and we did achieve purification, but not actual isolation. And at that time, Park Davis, a pharmaceutical company in Detroit, Michigan, was interested in this vitamin, which was then named folic acid because another investigator had found it in the spinach leaves, and so it came a folic acid. But it was widely distributed in nature and required by many organisms. So anyway, while I worked with Park Davis, we isolated the vitamin in crystalline form, and that was in the 40s, and when the World War II was finished, the university had a lot of increase in enrollment, and I was invited back to the University of Missouri to join the faculty in agricultural chemistry. And when Dr. Hogan retired, I essentially assumed the research that he had going, and that was mostly, at that time, he was interested in hydrocephalus in rats whose mothers, baby rats, whose mothers had consumed a purified diet. And one of the first things I worked with was trying to find out what was the active ingredient, and it turned out that both folic acid and vitamin B12 would prevent the hydrocephalus. So as I started to say, when Dr. Hogan retired, then I pursued that for a while, but also began to search for new vitamins. We thought there were no end to vitamins. But vitamin B12 seemed to be the end of the road, and so we were still looking, but, well, it turned out that in the long run that some of the stimulation from natural ingredients came from a trace elements, and we found that zinc was the important constituent. The question is, why did all of a sudden zinc become important, and that in these diets? Well, it turned related to the change in protein source in the diet, and we now use soy protein rather than casein, and soy protein contains phytic acid, which binds zinc and prevents its absorption. So, in other words, it decreases the bioavailability of zinc. And that, I think, is one of the important observations that explains zinc deficiency in the human population in parts of the world. Well, of course, in some sense, I've been very close to the University of Missouri all my career, but I have taken the opportunity, a very rich opportunity which the university has given for leaves of absence. And first one I did was at the University of Wisconsin at the Enzyme Institute. I spent a summer there. Then later I spent a summer at the National Institutes of Health. And then still later, I took a year's leave and spent a year in Cambridge, England, and that was a very rewarding time. And before I went to England, I had discovered the important role of copper in nutrition and metabolism. We produced copper deficiency in the chicken by feeding a diet that was obviously low in copper, a milk-based diet, and the chickens died spontaneously, almost when we're holding them, especially when they're exerted. And it turns out that the cause of death was aortic rupture. The large vessel ruptured and the chicken died spontaneously, and that stimulated my interest. What caused this? And to make a long story short, copper plays a very important role in connective tissue integrity, and the copper deficient chickens had a low content of elastin and collagen because those proteins could not be cross-linked. And it turns out that there's an enzyme, lysyl oxidase, which is copper dependent. That is, it contains copper, and in copper deficiency, that enzyme which converts lysine to compounds called desmosines, which cross-link the connective tissues and give stability. This enzyme fails, and so we have aortic rupture, and that is an important function. Well, that's preliminary to say that when we had observed those, I had contact with Dr. Partridge at Cambridge, and he had just discovered the two compounds that form the cross-links in elastin. These were the desmosine and isodesmosine. And while working in his lab, we could analyze some of the connective tissue from the copper-deficient chickens and show that that the desmosine and isodesmosine content were down. And so that was a real highlight, I think, in my research, that showing the importance of copper in that connective tissue integrity. And to pursue that, a few years later, I took another sabbatical leave. You see, I'm always going on leaves. I went to, well, I took a year, but I spent the first 6 months in Boston with Bert Vallee's lab, who was interested in particularly zinc, but connective or trace elements in general, and that was a rewarding experience. He was probably one of the outstanding biochemists and that in the enzymes and that were involved are essential trace elements. Well, then I followed that 6 months with 6 months in Australia, and I wanted to follow up on the copper story. And it's been known for many years that the sheep grown on much of the pastures, or what they call paddocks, were copper deficient, and the lambs born to those ewes developed ataxia, which the farmers called swayback, because they swayed from side to side, not like a swayback horse, but so this swayback lambs, and then finally they would get down to where they couldn't even stand. And I have pictures of them, of some that where the farmers had failed to fertilize for many years, and so we were able to get samples and then why did they develop this ataxia? That was the question, and they had thought it was demyelination, but anyway, we took brain samples from these copper deficient lambs and found that the brain, particularly the locomotor area, was affected, and they did not produce the dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter for particularly locomotion. And so when I came home, I was able to reproduce this in the rat. So this is two things in copper: the connective tissue and the neurological problem. And one of my graduate students found out that that the neurons were being destroyed. The dopaminergic neurons did not survive copper deficiency. Well, of course, AIN has been, probably established to sponsor meetings and sponsor publications. I think the number one, and it's still probably number one, meetings, number one, and publication of journals, and to sponsor reliable, well run editorial journals, and the meetings have an important part in education. That was probably I'll call it the third thing, but the meeting and education is probably one and the same thing. And I want to emphasize that the meeting of young people, for young people, is the primary educational value. And AIN has done a great job, I think, with the RIS and getting students involved in meetings and presenting posters, and that, I think, is a very positive thing that should be. There's only one thing that I could suggest that for the future might be to have a little more education about the ethics of research and publishing. That I'm not saying that there's a problem with AIN people, but it is cropping up in other areas, and I think it would be well to keep our students and younger members educated with the ethics of research and publishing. I remember that I think Dick Barnes was the president preceding me, and he had started some committees that looking at the future of the exact question that you raised, what should we be doing? And I think it's that continuing planning. Of course, we had very little communication. We didn't have nutrition notes or very much way to communicate among, so there was less activity, and there was essentially no, well, just the beginning of a office, and so there, besides the meeting itself, and well, of course, we had committees, meetings. I appointed committees that looked at various things, awards, and particularly awards was important. I think that if you want to, your graduate students, of course, it's not true very much nowadays as it was in my early days, but if you want graduate students to come in the evening and Saturdays, you better show up some at the same time. Right. I guess the Federation was sponsoring these meetings in New England. I was asked to initiate the first trace element conference, and I found that very useful. As I guess AIN still sponsors or is involved in this.
Yes, definitely.
I remember Mattie Ray Fox. I don't know whether you know. She was involved. She was at I guess in the ag. In Washington, D.C., and well, she was at NIH, I guess, where I first met her, when she worked with George Briggs, and then she went on, I guess then she moved to USDA, but she was interested in trace elements, and she was involved in, I think, getting that started, but